Burma, 1945. The jungle air was thick enough to chew, the kind that glued sweat to the skin and made silence hum. Inside a bamboo command post, a candle flickered over maps scarred with red pins. Outside, the rain hadn't started, but it was coming. The young women of the Japanese Auxiliary Corps stood in line, hands clasped behind backs, uniforms stiff with humidity. They'd served tea, cleaned wounds, carried messages. Tonight, though, an order arrived that none of them had words for. At 22:07, the coded message came from Regional Command: "You'll sleep with us tonight." No explanation, no context, just the instruction passed from officer to sergeant, from sergeant to the girls who had stopped being soldiers the moment those words were read. The officers didn't shout, they didn't leer, they just spoke softly, as if the cruelty would sound kinder that way. In the flicker of the lantern, Private Eiko Takeda's eyes darted toward her friend Mariko. Neither moved, neither breathed. They'd heard rumors about the field camps, the ones no one mentioned by name, but this was different. These weren't conquered women. They were comrades, or had been until that sentence redefined them. Records from surviving units show that over 20,000 Japanese women served in field support roles by 1945, nurses, typists, clerks. Most were under 23, few expected to see Tokyo again. Their training manuals never included this order, but obedience had long been their only shield. "We obeyed everything," one would later whisper, even when it destroyed us. That night, the sound of boots on gravel mixed with the distant crackle of artillery. Some women prayed, others just stared at their hands, waiting to be called. The candle burned low, turning the room sepia with smoke. When it finally went dark, the jungle outside roared to life. Cicadas, frogs, a faraway engine rumbling like an omen. Hours later, as dawn began to melt through the fog, Eiko sat alone on her cot. The bamboo beneath her creaked. Blood dotted the edge of her sleeve, already drying into the fabric. She tore the patch off her uniform and tucked it under her pillow. Outside, the first light broke across the camp, pale and colorless, as if even the sun refused to look. Tomorrow would bring silence and the lie of normal routine. Morning came without birdsong. The jungle was still, as if the night's shame had smothered even the insects. The rising sun filtered through torn canvas and dust, cutting the camp into fragments of gold and shadow. In one of those shadows sat Eiko Takeda, staring into a dented metal cup filled with cold water. Her reflection looked older, harder, like someone she didn't recognize. The camp around her buzzed with artificial order, mess kits clattering, boots crunching on gravel, officers pretending last night never happened. The women moved like ghosts, no one spoke above a whisper. Their hair was neatly tied again, lips pale, uniforms buttoned perfectly, as if discipline could erase memory. Eiko's hands shook as she cleaned a medical tray. The smell of iodine mixed with something metallic and sour. Every sound, every cough, every barked command felt like a reminder. Official reports would later note that nearly 80% of Japan's female auxiliaries were under 22, drafted from schools under the promise of patriotic nursing. But this morning, patriotism was just another word that had lost its meaning. The women had been told to support morale. They hadn't been told that meant surrendering what little control they still had. One of the senior nurses, Nakamura-san, tried to break the silence by reciting from a tattered hymn book. Her voice wavered. Half the girls didn't even lift their heads. Eiko just watched sunlight slide across the floorboards and stop at her feet. She couldn't cry. Tears would have made it real. We obeyed everything until that night. Someone whispered behind her, so quietly it might have been the wind. Outside, engines coughed to life. Orders shouted. The battalion was moving, retreating deeper into the jungle. The Americans were advancing from the west, and supplies were running thin. Eiko packed medical kits with trembling hands, slipping a piece of cloth into her pocket, the same patch she'd torn from her uniform last night. The convoy was forming up. Trucks groaned under crates of bandages, morphine, and secrets. As the sun climbed higher, the camp began to dissolve. Bamboo huts stripped, flags pulled down, tracks carved into the mud. Eiko climbed into the back of a transport truck, the engine roaring beneath her feet. The wind hit her face, carrying the stench of fuel and wet earth. She didn't know it yet, but this convoy would never return. The jungle road twisted like a scar, half mud, half memory. Trucks rattled in single file, engines coughing smoke into the morning haze. Eiko clutched the side rail, wind whipping her hair as the convoy roared through the green tunnels of Burma. The air smelled of fuel and rain, of something ending. Nobody spoke. The men up front pretended the women in back didn't exist. Orders had turned them invisible. Hours passed, the heat rose, metal burned to the touch. Somewhere ahead, a driver shouted, then came the sound they all feared, the whine of aircraft engines, distant but closing. Eiko froze, the sky above shimmered like glass. The first strafing run hit before anyone could dive. A burst of fire tore through the lead truck, flipping it into the ditch. Gasoline ignited instantly, a column of black smoke clawing at the clouds. The convoy scattered like ants. Eiko jumped, hitting the mud shoulder. First, her ears ringing. She crawled under a fallen crate, the air alive with bullets. A second plane screamed overhead, dropping napalm canisters that burst into rolling fireballs. The heat hit like a wall. Of the 18 trucks that left that morning, only 6 were found intact by sunset. Later, Allied reports counted 12 destroyed vehicles along that road, their metal frames warped and melted. Survivors crawled out half, burned, some still gripping charred bandages and morphine kits. When silence finally returned, it wasn't relief, it was accusation. The jungle hissed, the fire crackled. Somewhere, someone whispered a prayer that dissolved into coughing. Eiko's uniform was soaked, not from blood, but from the creek she'd dragged herself into. She watched smoke rise over the canopy, thinking it looked like Tokyo after a bombing. By dusk, the survivors gathered 14 women, 2 officers, 1 driver with both legs gone. They built a makeshift stretcher and started walking east. Every step squelched in mud. The sound of distant gunfire followed, fading in and out with the wind. They didn't know the Allies were already closing in from both sides. They didn't know surrender was the only option left. But by the time night fell, their boots were gone, their rations soaked, and their flag burned. When they finally stumbled into Allied lines the next morning, hands raised, the war had changed shape again. The surrender wasn't dramatic, just a limp white rag tied to a bamboo stick, fluttering weakly in the morning wind. The survivors stepped out of the jungle barefoot, uniforms in tatters, faces streaked with ash. British soldiers raised their rifles, then hesitated. These weren't the hardened enemy they'd been trained to expect. These were nurses, clerks, girls with hollow eyes. Eiko's knees buckled as they reached the clearing. A medic shouted, and within seconds the scene turned from threat to rescue. Canteens were handed out, a jeep rolled up carrying crates of morphine and biscuits. Someone tossed a blanket over her shoulders. The fabric smelled of soap and tobacco, foreign, but gentle. They were taken to a temporary processing tent near Maktila. The British guards kept their distance at first, confused. They're Japanese, one asked, women. Another added, incredulous. Inside the tent, the air was cool and antiseptic. The women were given bandages, tea, and thin metal cups of soup. For the first time in years, they were treated, not inspected. Official records show that 94 women were among the 2,000 Japanese POW processed in that sector in early August 1945. Most were listed as Auxiliary Medical Corps, non-combatant. No one dared record the unspoken reason behind their capture, the order that had stripped them of their uniforms long before the Allies ever did. Eiko sat across from a British nurse named Ellen, who cleaned a burn on her arm. Ellen didn't speak Japanese, and Eiko didn't understand English, but the silence between them wasn't cruel. It was human. When Ellen offered her a biscuit, Eiko hesitated, then accepted. The taste was dry, foreign, safe. One of the captured Japanese officers muttered bitterly, "They treat us better than our own command." No one replied, but the words hung in the air like smoke. That night, the women were given cots under mosquito nets. The camp generator buzzed softly, powering a single light bulb that glowed above them like a fragile moon. Eiko stared up at it, unable to sleep. Every blink burned with the question, why did kindness hurt more than cruelty? By morning, the interrogations would begin, and the silence would have to speak. The interrogation tent smelled of wet canvas, ink, and boiled tea. Outside, rain hissed on tin roofs. Inside, Eiko sat across from a British officer who looked more like a schoolteacher than an interrogator, thin glasses, calm voice, hands too gentle for war. He didn't raise his tone, he didn't threaten. He just poured tea into 2 tin cups and slid one across the table. Eiko didn't touch it at first. She had braced for shouting, for punishment, for the kind of cruelty she'd already learned from her own side. Instead, there was quiet. The interpreter, a young Anglo-Indian man named Patel, spoke softly in halting Japanese. "We want to understand what happened, no punishment, just truth, truth." The word felt dangerous. Eiko's lips trembled as she tried to answer. At first, she gave rehearsed lines, the same phrases drilled into every recruit. "We served honorably. We followed command." But Patel didn't interrupt. He just waited. The rain outside slowed to a murmur. The silence stretched until she couldn't bear it anymore. Finally, she said it. "The order." The words came out broken. "They told us we will sleep with them." Her hands shook so violently the teacup rattled against the table. Patel froze. The British officer stopped writing. For a moment, even the rain outside seemed to pause. Later, declassified records from the British India Command confirmed over 300 interrogations of Japanese female POW during the final months of 1945. Most interviews lasted under an hour. Eiko's lasted 3. When it ended, she wasn't dismissed, she was thanked. And handed another cup of tea. That simple act broke her. She sobbed without sound, shoulders quaking, while the officer pretended to check his notes. When Patel translated her last sentence, his voice faltered. She says she didn't think anyone would ever believe her. That night, Eiko was moved to a rest hut away from the main barracks. Her cot was clean. There was a small mirror on the wall and a folded towel at its edge. Outside, lightning flashed across the horizon, lighting the jungle like camera flashes. She sat on the cot, cradling the untouched second cup of tea in both hands until it went cold. The next morning, someone new entered her hut. A woman in a white arm, band-marked with a red cross. The woman with the red cross on her sleeve introduced herself in slow, careful English as Nurse Margaret. Eiko didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, soft, steady, human. The Red Cross had arrived. Their trucks rolled in through mud and memory, carrying bandages, soap, and letters that carried pieces of a home that no longer existed. That afternoon, the POW hut buzzed with nervous energy. The nurses handed out small brown envelopes, each stamped with the red emblem of neutrality. Eiko's hands trembled as she held hers. The return address read, Tokyo, formerly Chiyoda Ward. She didn't open it immediately. Around her, the others tore theirs open with shaking fingers, gasping, crying, laughing through tears. But, one by one, the laughter died. The letters spoke of ruins. Our home turned to glass. One woman whispered, clutching the paper to her chest. Another read that her brother had died in a firestorm, no remains found. The Red Cross nurse didn't understand Japanese, but she understood grief. She just stood there, hat in her hands, eyes wet. By the summer of 1945, 67 Japanese cities had been bombed to ash. Over 8 million civilians were displaced. To the women in the hut, that number wasn't history, it was home. The empire they'd been told to die for had already burned, while they were still marching through jungle mud. Eiko finally opened her letter, Her mother's handwriting was faint, words trembling across the page. Echo, we heard your Yoon. It was lost. The house is gone, father too. But if you live kindly. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and pressed it to her lips. That night she couldn't sleep. Outside, rain hammered the tin roof, blurring the world into grey streaks. She stepped out barefoot, the mud cool beneath her feet. The rain hit her face, washing away the sweat, the soot, the lies. She stood there until she was shivering, holding the letter tight to her chest. Behind her, a lantern flickered inside the hut, her shadow stretching long and thin across the ground, as if the past itself were trying to hold her back. And as the storm deepened, the rain began to smell faintly of smoke. By dawn, the camp was a swamp. The monsoon had swallowed everything: boots, tents, even the smell of soap from yesterday's supplies. The rain didn't stop. It just changed rhythm, like a drummer who refused to rest. Inside the huts, tin bowls filled with muddy water. Outside, the drainage ditches overflowed, carrying twigs, cigarette butts, and scraps of the past. Echo woke to coughing. The nurse in the next cot, Mariko, was burning up, skin slick with sweat, lips cracked. Malaria had taken hold. Echo tried to cool her forehead with a damp cloth, but the fever didn't break. The Red Cross nurses were stretched thin, medicine was rationed. By noon they'd run out of quinine again. The rain kept falling, louder now, as if to drown out the sound of wheezing. By August 1945, official camp logs showed disease killed more POW than bullets across Southeast Asia. Malaria, dysentery, and cholera were the quiet executioners, striking without politics or pity. In that hut, the war no longer had uniforms. It just had temperatures, rashes, and trembling hands. Mariko tried to speak, her voice barely a whisper. Do you think they'll let us go home? Echo wanted to answer, but the word home felt hollow. She looked at the rain sliding down the canvas walls, carrying flecks of red dirt that looked too much like blood. When Mariko's breathing stopped, it was almost gentle, like the rain had simply carried her away. Echo stayed beside her body until the guards came. They carried her out under a tarp, the fabric clinging to her shape. A small wooden cross was hammered into the mud near the fence line. No prayers, no ceremony, just a name scratched into the wood with a spoon handle. That evening, the British allowed the surviving POW to attend the burial. The rain fell in sheets, turning the gravesite into a mirror of puddles. A young British officer stood nearby, cap in hand. He didn't speak either. When Echo looked up, she saw something rare in his eyes: shame. He saluted quietly before turning away, boots sinking into the mud. That man's name, she would later learn, was Major Collins. Major William Collins hadn't planned on pity. He'd seen enough death to build walls around it. Men torn apart, villages burning, mercy rationed like morphine. But that burial changed something. The sight of the young Japanese nurse kneeling in the mud beside her dead friend didn't fit into any war he understood. That night, under a single bulb in the command tent, he opened his logbook. These women, he wrote, were never soldiers. They are casualties of obedience. His pen scratched fast, then stopped. He added nothing more, just signed it W.C. Maktila Sector. 2 days later, rations came short again. The officers' mess kept its share, but Collins slipped into the POW compound with a tin of condensed milk and 3 biscuits. A Red Cross nurse caught him but said nothing. He left them on the table near Echo's cot, pretending to inspect the roof for leaks. Word spread. Some of his men started calling him the ghost captain, the one who gave mercy without orders. When his superior found out, Collins was reprimanded. Discipline keeps the war clean, his colonel barked. Collins didn't reply. In his mind, the war had never been clean. It just wore cleaner uniforms. Records from that month show Allied supply rations split unevenly. 500 calories per day for male POW, 600 for female prisoners. It wasn't policy, it was indifference. Yet, in Collins' sector, medical reports quietly noted improved nutrition. among the Japanese women. He'd bent the math and hoped no one checked. One evening, Eiko saw him again, standing by the fence, cap off, smoking in silence. She bowed slightly, unsure why. He looked startled, then gave a small nod, eyes averted. Neither spoke. That moment, awkward, human, wordless, stuck with her more than any sermon could have. In his next journal entry, Collins wrote, "We fight monsters by becoming smaller ones. I don't know where the line vanished." He closed the book as headlights appeared over the hill. An inspection convoy, jeeps, cameras, officers in clean uniforms, was rolling in from Rangoon. By sunrise, Mercy would need to look presentable. The jeeps arrived at dawn, tires slicing through the wet mud. Major Collins stood rigid as the inspection team stepped out, fresh uniforms, polished boots, eyes scanning the camp like auditors of morality. Cameras followed them, whirring softly, the new kind of weapon. The Red Cross nurse whispered to Eiko, "Smile if they look at you." The order was simple, show the world they're fine. The women lined up outside the huts, their threadbare uniforms scrubbed overnight until the seams nearly tore. Eiko's hair was tied tight, her face powdered with chalk to hide the bruising on her neck. The sun came out just long enough to make everything look staged. A lieutenant from the Allied PR unit barked, "Chin up. Let's have something usable for the reels." One by one, they walked past the cameras. Eiko tried to keep her eyes steady, but when the lens fixed on her, her throat closed. Behind the photographer, Collins looked away, jaw tight. The reel clicked and spun, capturing what history would later call humanitarian order. Archival data confirms that 14 Allied photo reels were filmed that year across Burma and Malaya, portraying well-treated Japanese female POW. Most were staged. The bruises were covered, the smiles rehearsed. The film was edited for public morale, proof that mercy, too, could be propaganda. After the inspection, food rations briefly improved, as if image and empathy were somehow linked. The women were given new soap, cleaner sheets, and one extra ladle of rice. "They'll use our faces to clean their conscience," one nurse muttered. Eiko didn't reply. She just kept staring at the metal tray, seeing her reflection ripple in the soup. That night, when the camp lights dimmed, Eiko crept into the tent where the camera reels had been stored. She found a discarded photograph, her own face, frozen mid-smile. She folded it and hid it inside her small cloth journal. The rain outside returned, soft but relentless, like film static. The generators buzzed, cutting power for a moment, plunging the camp into darkness. In that darkness, truth felt briefly safe again. But secrets like film always get developed eventually. The photo hid between the journal's thin pages like a wound that refused to close. Every night, after lights out, Eiko would write under her blanket by matchlight. Not about glory or duty, just names, places, the orders that had broken them. Her handwriting was small, urgent, terrified. She knew if anyone found it, it wouldn't just cost her freedom, it could cost her life. The journal wasn't meant to be rebellion. It was survival. Ink became the only weapon left that didn't draw blood. She listed the women who'd vanished from the camp, those transferred south, or reassigned. Everyone knew what those words meant, but no one said them aloud. She wrote about the night of the order, "You'll sleep with us tonight." No translation needed. Her hand shook when she wrote that line, but she didn't stop. Later records would reveal only 3 surviving diaries from Japanese female POW. All handwritten, all smuggled in Red Cross packages or hidden in canteens. Eiko's would have been the 4th, if it had survived. One morning, during a random inspection, a guard lifted her mattress and found it. The pages fluttered open like trapped birds. Eiko lunged to grab it, but 2 soldiers pinned her arms. The interpreter, Patel, was summoned. He looked at her face, then at the notebook, and hesitated. "What is this?" he asked quietly. She couldn't answer. The silence was louder than confession. They took the journal to Major Collins. He read it alone in his tent, lips tightening with every page. When he reached the part about the order, he stopped. His hand went to his temple, rubbing hard. He understood now that the war he'd been fighting on paper had another front entirely, one his country would never want documented. He didn't burn the diary, he sealed it in a brown envelope marked confidential, testimony POW, W Sector D. That night, Aiko sat in her cot, hands empty, eyes fixed on the ceiling. She felt lighter and lonelier all at once. Somewhere, a generator clicked off, plunging the camp into silence. At dawn, Patel would come to her hut, holding that same envelope. His orders changed, his conscience heavier. The morning smelled of damp paper and kerosene. Patel stood outside the hut with the sealed envelope in his hands, unsure which weighed more, the document or his conscience. His orders were clear: deliver the diary to headquarters in Rangoon for review and classification. But the look on Aiko's face when they took it, that look had followed him into every dream since. Inside the command tent, Collins waited, still in his undershirt, rubbing his temples. Patel hesitated before stepping in. "Sir, about the girl's journal," he began. Collins gestured for him to sit. "I've read it," the major said quietly. "If London reads it, they'll file it under misconduct, on our side or theirs." He paused. "But if we bury it, the truth dies twice." Patel looked down. His throat tightened. He was 25, bilingual, a translator of facts, but this wasn't translation. This was testimony. He'd heard every version of duty in this war, from every flag. But Aiko's words had no accent. They were just pain written neatly in black ink. He opened the envelope and began reading aloud. The tent fell silent except for the rain and his trembling voice. "They told us to serve honor, but honor came in human form. They told us we were part of the army, but the army took parts of us." Collins didn't speak for a long time. The logbooks around him looked suddenly absurd, neat tables of calories, rations, ammunition. "She's not writing rebellion," he muttered. "She's writing evidence. Historical records confirm that less than 1% of sexual abuse cases involving Japanese military command were ever documented during the war. The rest disappeared into silence, classified, misplaced, or destroyed. Patel knew this report, if buried, would join that silence. That afternoon, he sent a memo requesting the diary be submitted as potential war crimes evidence. It was stamped received, then vanished from the trail completely. The file never reached Rangoon. That night, Patel sat by the fence, cigarette trembling between his fingers. Aiko sat on the other side, watching the smoke curl through the wire. Neither spoke. He wanted to tell her he'd tried, but words in any language felt too small. When she finally whispered, "Thank you," he couldn't meet her eyes, because he'd already failed. By morning, the envelope and her diary were gone. 3 decades later, the war existed only in textbooks and nightmares. In a dim Tokyo archive room, fluorescent lights hummed over rows of grey filing cabinets. A junior researcher named Mori was sorting declassified microfilm when he noticed a reel mislabeled. POW female, Sector D. He almost skipped it. Then he saw the faded British seal stamped confidential, 1945. He loaded it into the reader. The machine clicked, and grainy frames flickered across the screen pages of a diary, written in Japanese. Ink faded, handwriting delicate. Between the lines, fragments of an order appeared. "You'll sleep with us tonight." Mori froze. He adjusted the focus, heart thudding, the name at the bottom of the page, A. Taikta. According to post-war archives, over 400 zero Japanese military documents had been microfilmed by Allied intelligence and returned to Japan in the 1950. Many were never indexed. In 1977, a quiet declassification wave opened a few of them, but the contents were buried in academic silence. This reel was one of those lost fragments. Mori printed the pages, hands shaking. The text alternated between despair and discipline, guilt and obedience. It wasn't just a diary, it was an indictment. One entry read, "Mercy was the only thing that hurt." He checked the records, no mention of Aiko Taikta, no record of her capture, release, or death. History had erased her neatly. He brought the find to his supervisor, who frowned. "Let it rest," the man said. "There's no public value in reopening this." The file was quietly restamped for reference only and returned to the shelf. Bureaucratic Burial, Part 2. It would take until 1993 before any documentation of Japanese female POW reached publication, just footnotes in academic journals, stripped of names. By then, most of the women were gone. Their memories lived only in the faint scratches of a typewriter ribbon and the static of microfilm. Mori kept a copy of one frame for himself. He folded it inside his wallet. A single sentence that wouldn't leave him. "We were told to serve honor, but honor had no face." Years later, when a historian contacted him about a surviving nurse from that camp, he reached for that old printout, already yellow at the edges. The name was the same, A. Teikta, Tokyo, 1995. The city pulsed with neon and noise, but in a small apartment above a ramen shop, time had stopped. Eiko Teikta, 80 years old, spine curved like a question mark, lived surrounded by silence and fading photographs. The war had followed her home, not as a memory, but as an uninvited guest that never left. The historian, Professor Mori, knocked gently. She opened the door wearing a housecoat and slippers, her eyes cloudy but sharp. When he introduced himself and mentioned the diary, she froze. "You found it," she whispered. He nodded, holding out the printed microfilm frame. Her trembling hand reached for it like a relic. She stared at the sentence she'd written half a century ago. "You'll sleep with us tonight." Her lips moved soundlessly. On a small table sat the old black and white photograph she had stolen from the camp, the one where she was smiling for the Allied cameras. The edges were worn from years of folding. She turned it toward Mori. "That smile," she said softly, "wasn't mine." According to Health Ministry archives, by 2015, fewer than 12 surviving Japanese women POW were still alive. Their average age, 91 years, most never spoke publicly. They died in quiet anonymity, no honors, no recognition, just the steady erasure of time. Eiko was one of the last. Mori set up a small tape recorder. The click of the button echoed like a gunshot in that small room. "Can you tell me what you remember most?" he asked. Eiko didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window at the falling rain. "Same sound as Burma half a lifetime ago." "I remember," she said finally, "that they called us sisters only after we stopped bleeding." The tape hissed softly. The city traffic outside faded. She spoke for hours, her voice fragile but precise, not about revenge. Not even sorrow. Just memory measured, honest, unblinking. When she grew tired, Mori turned off the recorder. She smiled faintly, not at him but at the window, where the rain streaked down like film scratches. "It's strange," she murmured, "to still be waiting for permission to be human." Her hand trembled as she reached for a cup of tea. The tape reels kept spinning long after her voice stopped. By morning, that recording would travel further than she ever had. Years later, her voice returned through speakers, not lungs. In a museum basement in Hiroshima, a small crowd gathered around a flickering screen. The recording clicked on. Static, then breathe, then Eiko's frail voice filling the room. "We obeyed everything," she said, her tone steady. "Even when it destroyed us." The audience, students, tourists, veterans, stood still. The sound of one woman breaking her silence had become louder than 1,000 speeches. The footage played as part of a new exhibit titled The Forgotten POW. On the wall behind the screen hung a black and white photograph, Eiko at 19, the same one she had hidden for decades. Her face looked almost defiant now, not because she had survived, but because she had been remembered. By the early 2000s, over 20,000 recorded testimonies from POW across all nations had been digitized by museums and universities worldwide. Among them were fewer than 20 from Japanese women. Echoes was one of those voices, the final note of a song no one had wanted to hear. A student in the crowd whispered, "She sounds calm." His teacher replied quietly, "That's not calm. That's what truth sounds like when it finally stops asking permission." As the tape played, Echo's story unspooled in monochrome detail: rain on tin roofs, orders whispered under lantern light, teacups trembling between captor and captive. Her last words on the tape lingered longer than any image. "You'll sleep with us tonight" still echoes louder than bombs. Then came silence. Pure, heavy, unbroken. In that silence people didn't move. Some closed their eyes. Others wrote her name down on notepads as if afraid history might erase it again. When the screen finally went dark, the curator stepped forward and said only 3 words: she was real. Outside, dusk settled over the city. School children filed out quietly, their reflections passing through the museum's glass doors like ghosts. The rain had started again, the same sound, the same rhythm, and somewhere, in the static of an old recording, her breath still lingered. Proof that memory, once given voice, never truly dies.